Good evening. Welcome to the webinar today. It's on the subject, a vital subject of fossil fuel subsidies and their reform. And we're talking today about how can we move from action to commitment. The webinar is brought to you by the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform group. They're a group of 10 governments whose purpose is to build political consensus on the importance of fossil fuel subsidy reform. They formed in 2010, and we can see very strongly since then that the amount of political consensus and the amount of attention that the issue of fossil fuel subsidies has received just continues to increase. You know, we hear almost every event now somebody is calling for the reform of fossil fuel subsidies. And what we're looking at today is to say, how can we move beyond these calls, beyond the commitments that we now see in all the major forums and processes? So we can look at G7 and G20, where we've got our representatives today from Germany and from Indonesia. APEC has been busy on this issue, and we'll be hearing from last year's APEC presidency, from New Zealand. UNFCCC has made a first commitment or a first comment in the Glasgow Climate Pact. We'll be hearing more from Jennifer Allen about the UNFCCC. The SDGs include now a transparency requirement on one of the indicators around fossil fuel subsidies. We're hearing from Lourdes Sanchez about that. And then the CSO community is also very keen that the countries around the world really progress this issue as quickly as possible, and that we move again from actions to commitments as soon as we can. And we're very happy to have Ipek Gengsu today from ODI in London joining us. In terms of format, we have sort of two parts. We'll firstly hear some welcoming remarks from the Netherlands, who are the newest member of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Group. We'll then hear from the G7, the G20 and APEC, and then we'll move on to a second part where we'll hear from around the UNFCCC, around the SDGs and transparency, and around civil society commitments, and then go into Q&A. There should be plenty of time today for interactive discussion. We've got a joint problem ahead of us. There's a huge amount of commitment to this issue and pushing it forward, but the real question is, you know, what do we do next? What are the languages we need? What's the language we need in the various agreements? Which subsidies do we deal with first? How do we do it? And that's what we're looking to progress as a group today. Very interested in what people on the audience are thinking and suggesting. You know, please put your suggestions into the chat, into the Q&A functions here on Zoom, and we'll get onto those questions as well. So part webinar, part working group today. And without further ado, I'm really happy to introduce our first speaker for today to give the welcoming remarks. His Royal Highness Prince Jaime de Bourbon de Parme is the climate envoy of the Netherlands. He's got extensive experience in international relations and multilateral organizations, has been a senior advisor for private sector partnerships at the UNHCR, Dutch ambassador to the Holy See, and amongst many other posts that is in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the European Commission. So over to you, Mr. de Bourbon, and I'm very interested to hear from you. So, you know, why are we thinking about this issue, and what do you think are some of the next steps that need to happen?
Well, thank you, Peter, for giving a newbie in this group the opening remarks, and just to set the scene or continue setting the scene with you, Peter. And I want to thank the Institute for Sustainable Development for hosting us. This is an important dialogue, and it's good to be among friends to talk about the current state of fossil fuel subsidy reform at the international level. Now, we're facing a massive challenge, and we have to refocus all our resources for global energy investment. Only last week, Peter, the UN Secretary General underlined the priority of mobilizing $5 trillion annually for the energy transition. And there's no way that governments by themselves can rack up that money. We do need to use our funds to trigger private sector investment into this field for that energy transformation. And we should see our funds, which are substantial governments, but we should see them as scarce and really direct the funds towards the direction that we need for a green economy. I'm very happy to report that we have received some encouraging signs of fossil fuel subsidy reform. Peter, you're very optimistic about it, and I think I share some of the optimism. The G7 committed to end government support for overseas coal-fired power, and major financial institutions signed the PPCA finance principles to stop financing new powered coal for power plants. So the signatories also included, and I'm very happy to see that, ABP, which happens to be my pension fund. All the civil servants in the Netherlands are part of it and beyond. And this is the third largest pension fund in the world, with about 500 billion in assets. And prior to the COP, they already said they wouldn't invest into coal anymore abroad. But just a couple of days before the COP, they announced they would divest from all fossil fuels. And if one pension fund does so, and a pension fund, I think it's a good ally to talk, all of us to talk to, because they've got a long-term intergenerational perspective, and they don't want to get stuck also with stranded assets, and they do want to adhere to the customer base, in our case, civil servants and many others, concerned citizens. So, and if such a big pension fund moves, I think it's easy to have a dialogue with many other pension funds around the world in each of your countries to see if they might move as well, and they might have moved already. So, so it's a very encouraging sign to see this happening. At Glasgow, the Netherlands actually made an unforeseen real policy shift as we joined the group of countries who are committed to end direct public financing of new unabated fossil fuel projects abroad, and to end them by 2022, and to prioritize transition to a green economy. Now, when we went into the COP, we were about 2/3 of the way to think this through. And the civil servants, we felt, this was gonna happen at a certain point, but we didn't feel that it was the right time. But politically, it became the right time at the COP. And we stand by it. And we saw that very shortly. We're very happy to see Germany. There was also a government in process of being formed. It took us about a year, but Germany was in the midst of that process as well. But they also were able to make a decision even in that political interbellum. And soon after, Spain, France, and Belgium followed suit as well. So you really saw a sort of domino effect at the COP of countries following this political momentum. And at the end, the statement was signed by 34 countries and 5 development banks. So this is a very solid step forward, and it should encourage other countries and banks to join as well. And the next step is to formulate the grounds for exceptions, exceptions between signatories that do justice to the ambitious statement and to the Paris Agreement. We should not find exemptions and excuses to go back to actually what it was and just have lip service. The basic decision to shift our resources towards a green economy should stand. And it's a clear political decision. Now, we, the Netherlands, finally, we did form a government after the COP, and we have a joint coalition agreement. And it's basically the same government, but with very different policy on climate. We're very climate focused, and we will greatly invest in greening our industries. And we'll further investigate possibilities to phase out financial incentives for fossil fuels and end these incentives where possible, and really refocus towards a green economy. So that's a real commitment of the Dutch government, and I think very much in line with that of many governments that are calling into this call today. It was also very important to redirect our financial flows to clean energy, not just amongst ourselves, but also to the vulnerable communities around the world. We cooperate with developing countries on renewable energy projects. And through these projects, around 10 million people have gained access to clean energy since 2015. And amongst these also refugee communities. And Peter, you mentioned that I worked for the UN Refugee Agency prior to become climate envoy. And I worked on access to energy for refugees. And I must say, if you visit communities, not just refugees, but also those communities around them that are nearly as poor, without access to energy, then it means they have to cut wood for cooking. So the environment gets hurt. They have in competition with those communities. Women have to go out for wood every time further, always the same path. So there's a lot of gender-based violence associated with it. And if you have access to energy, you can have access to more education, livelihoods, access to connectivity, access to online finance, online jobs, you name it. So really energy has become a basic need for self-reliance. And so while we're thinking about this big transition for our own society, let's not forget those that need it as well to be included in our plans. Now, Peter, just closing, progress has been made. I'm very optimistic, as you said as well, but we're definitely not there yet. And that's why it's great that we're with friends together to learn and keep raising our ambition and to reposition ourselves as a global community to the realities of climate change. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vaughan. I think you've set up the issue very well there, and also very useful to make the links there between fossil fuel subsidy and public finance, between scarce government resources, and we hear this concept of swaps a lot. You know, can we redirect financial flows from fossil fuels to renewable energy? And of course, the Netherlands has been on this path very recently and is still on this path, and has made considerable progress from being regarded to quite a large extent as sort of big gas country into one now much more focused on the future and onto renewable energy. So we can learn a lot from you and your colleagues. So thank you very much. And also important as well to bring up the issues around access to energy and the poor and the vulnerable. And these are things that will come again and again in the fossil fuel subsidy debate. Thank you. So our next speaker on the first part of the panel is Berget Schwenk. Thank you for joining us, Berget. So I know you must be very busy setting up the G7 at the moment, and all the work programs and the commitments and what languages you're aiming for and all the events and so on. Berget Schwenk is the Director General for Climate Policy at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Protection. And that's obviously quite a recent post, and I think the ministries have just merged as well, so a very recent ministry too. Previously, she has led the Directorate for Strategic Aspects of Environmental Policy and Environmental Law at the German Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, so the old BMUB, and joined that ministry 20 years ago, worked on a variety of questions across energy, social policy, resource efficiency, circular economy, climate change, and cooperation with developing countries. So incredibly well qualified to speak to us today, and thank you for joining us, Berget. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Peter. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much for that kind introduction, and also to Jaime and you for mentioning that we've actually recently formed a new government as well. Managed to do so. And one of the news is that we now have an integrated ministry for climate protection and economic affairs, which I think is a very good move and shows that we want to pursue an integrated approach now to climate policy, energy policy, and economics policy, actually. So quite innovative, and as you mentioned, Peter, I've been in my present position for 1 month now, exactly. But I hope that you'll find that I can already say a few words on our plans for the G7 presidency, despite being new in this post. So this event, ladies and gentlemen, is very timely. The German government has just published its program for the G7 presidency a couple of days ago. And one of our priorities is actually working with civil society, which is once again why I'm very happy to be here. We've had a long-standing cooperation with the IISD and with civil society at large. And the challenges we're facing can actually be only solved if we all join forces, civil society, governments, national and international institutions, private companies, actually all stakeholders that we can muster for our challenge of getting to a 1.5-degree pathway. So a few words on our G7 presidency, short outlook. We've named a few priorities and a general motto for our G7 presidency. The general motto that we place our G7 presidency in is progress towards an equitable world. And one of our 5 priority areas is forming strong alliances for a sustainable planet, including climate as the top priority. So climate, as you can see, will be central to our G7 leaders. But we're also planning to hold a ministerial meeting, a joint ministerial meeting on climate, energy, and the environment. This is going to be held by the end of May, 25th to 27th of May. And I think that here, once again, we find this holistic, integrated approach that we think is essential in solving this challenge. We want to build strongly upon last year's G7 presidency and COP26 presidency, i.e. the UK, who have made a few very strong moves and initiated a few very, very good initiatives in this area, which we want to use and put even more forward, I hope, by our G7 presidency, because as you mentioned, Peter, this has to be the decade of action. So from commitment to action, that must be our motto. So what will be the deliverables that we want to focus on in our track on climate, energy, and the environment, or for today's meeting, the climate agenda especially? We want to accelerate national and international clean energy transition. So this is our overarching objective. Which means we would like to reach ambitious commitment on decarbonizing power, industry, transport, and buildings. There is, of course, which is why we're here, the G7 commitment to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, a subject where we've not seen as much progress as we all would have liked to see. So we hope to make some progress here. We also want to build upon the COP26 statement of international public support for clean energy transition, want to advance multilateral partnerships for climate, energy, and development. Then one area that is particularly dear to our Chancellor, Mr. Scholz, is we want to initiate an open climate club, which is meant to extend carbon pricing and standards for emission carbon pricing for two, let's say, countries that would like to join. So this is actually a very open offer for all the countries that we find here and even beyond the G7. Of course. And then, as I said, our general motto is sustainable, is progress towards an equitable world. So solidarity with developing countries and emerging economies is, of course, a very important subject to us, which means closing the climate finance gap, balancing adaptation finance, and also, of course, we have to deal with efforts on, well, we have to deal with losses and damages. So I hope that here, once again, we can contribute as the G7 presidency. And just in general, we need a just and inclusive and a resilient transformation in the G7 and globally, especially in the energy sector, but also beyond. And of course, together with civil society groups. So this was my short overview of what we want to achieve in the G7 presidency. It's a very ambitious program. So I hope that you'll all find us making progress here. We would certainly like to contribute to this global effort. So coming to our specific subject today, of course, all the areas mentioned require a systemic approach when it comes to policies, to regulation, to financing, market design, and of course, fiscal policies and carbon pricing mechanisms. We have to come up with a comprehensive approach. And we need to incentivize the phasing out of inefficient fossil fuels while we have to spur the development and the implementation of sustainable energy solutions. One thing we cannot afford to do any longer is to send contradictory signals to the market. And as has been said before, public financing is scarce, which we've seen through the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in, now actually 2 years' time. So we actually can't afford to spend public finance on contradictory goals. So this is one more reason why we would like to see some action and some progress on phasing out inefficient fossil fuels. So therefore, we are committed to our goal of phasing them out by 2025 and on getting up more speed, because we haven't seen as much progress as we would have liked to. This is a complex task because, of course, we have to have a look at social policy issues here as well. Phasing out fossil fuel subsidies affects many households and many companies, and it requires also, which makes it complex, a concerted action on, in our case, the European and the international level, and this cuts across a large range of sectors. So just to say, it's not an easy peasy task, and all the more important that we get down to action. We can't abolish all fossil fuel subsidies by tomorrow. Sorry, this is commonplace, but it has to be said every now and then. And also, I must admit that even in the German case, we find this is not as easy as it sounds. We have an energy transition that will have to go through some transitional means. For instance, in Germany, I'm very clear about this. We find that we cannot immediately stop investing in gas, for instance. We need this as a bridging technology, which in the end will lead us to renewable energies, but this is nothing that can be just done like that. And the main goal is that we make progress towards our 1.5 degree pathways. So what do we want to achieve, or what do we want to stimulate in our G7 presidency? I think a very important area is sharing best practices on how to implement an effort to phase out inefficient fossil fuels. Increasing transparency is a very important first step. And also not only on the subsidies that we have, but also on the inefficiencies and on the implications for different income groups, different groups in society. So in Germany, we've actually decided that we want to publish our own progress in phasing out fossil fuel subsidies in our annual climate policy reporting. So we'll do this for the first time in June this year. Very much looking forward to this. We're in the course of preparing, gathering the data. And in this context, I would also want to once again highlight the great work done by the IISD in that area with your fossil fuel subsidy tracker. That is very helpful, actually, on keeping the subject on the agenda consistently, constantly, and on just making the data more known around the world. So thank you very much for that. So I'm actually convinced, as has been shown by the very name of my ministry, that we can integrate our efforts on climate policy, on energy policy, on economics policy, and we'll come to concrete action. As I said, this is in the interest of all G7 countries, and we hope we can help making some progress in our G7 presidency on this. And having said that, I'm very much looking forward to what my colleagues are going to contribute now. After us, very much looking forward to see what the G20 presidency might be planning on this, and just looking forward to this great and timely event. Thank you very much, Peter, and over to you again.
Superb. Thanks so much, Berget. Really good to hear firstly the sort of framing of the issue you have in Germany, where you're mixing climate, energy, economy, environment, everything together. That we need a holistic approach, commitment to work with all the other groups. all the other stakeholders, be they other governments, international, national processes, sectors, power industry, transport, buildings. And I think a nice sort of dose of reality there that just all of us saying that we want subsidies to be reformed right now isn't going to make it happen. So how even in countries which have a lot of resources and have looked a lot at this issue, this will take some time. That doesn't mean we can't reform some of the subsidies right now, immediately, and also really good to hear that you'll be continuing with the 2025 push from the G7, because I think it's a view of a lot of the stakeholders in this that it may not be simple to reform everything right now, but we do need to give that very clear message that subsidies are not consistent with a safe climate, and therefore we need an end date and we all need to be working towards that. So great to hear that. And thanks for your kind words about ISD and for staying with the rest of the conversation too. So our next international process this year is the G20 is being chaired by Indonesia. We're really happy to have Andy Novianto with us this evening. His time, thank you very much for staying up so late. We really appreciate that. Andy's had a lot of years working experience on energy policy and economic development. So again, the two issues in Indonesia. He's currently serving in the Indonesia's Assistant Deputy Minister, serving as Indonesia's Assistant Deputy Minister at the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs. He's overseeing there the synchronization, formulation, stipulation and implementation of ministerial policies related to the issues in the fields of oil and gas. Also mining, also petrochemicals. So very large sectors in a very large country, and bringing together a lot of sort of complicated and complex issues here. Previously been the Assistant Deputy Minister in charge of energy productivity at the same ministry, the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs, which brings together all the economic interests in various ministries in Indonesia. So delighted to have you with us today, Andy. Thank you for supporting the event and supporting this issue so well. Very interested to hear a little bit more about the plans of Indonesia this year with the G20 presidency.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to you all. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I offer an apology that Mr. Montigriana is unable to attend today's webinar, so that's why I'm going to replace him. As mentioned by Peter, that I am a staff of Mr. Giriana as Assistant Deputy Minister for Oil and Gas, Mining and Petrochemicals within Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs. I would like to thank also to IISD to invite us for today's webinar. I will convey the theme, namely fossil fuel subsidy reform and broader action towards a clean energy transition fits into the agenda of Indonesia G20 presidency, and also what we are doing now in terms of fuel subsidy as well as to have a clean energy. Let me share my slide to make it. I hope that you can see that. So at the G20 presidency, Indonesia carried the theme of recover together and then recover stronger. And in the G20 presidency, Indonesia will focus on working on the three things. First, inclusive healthcare. Second, digital-based transformation. And then third, the transition to sustainable energy. So that we like to move from enabling environment and partnership with promoting productivity, increasing resilience and stability, ensuring a sustainable and inclusive growth, and to make a stronger collective global leadership. So the three themes here: global health, so post-pandemic global health governance and architecture, and then we are to have improving supply and of vaccines and essential medical products, where in digital economic transformation with post-pandemic global economic order with digitalization to make creating economic values for digital technology And then this is the third theme, which is energy transition. We like to have a global cleaner energy system and just transition, with achieving global deal to accelerate energy transition. So that this is a energy transition was firstly introduced as the tagline by G20 in 2018. So let me move to next slide here. That Indonesia is committed to reducing GHG emission by 29% from business as usual by 2030 and 41% with international assistance. And also Indonesia has ratified the Paris Agreement in October 2016 and submitted into the UNFCCC on 6 November 2016. And then, of course, within the Paris Agreement target that maintain a global temperature rise not exceeding 2 degrees Celsius and start to be at 1.5 degrees C. And then here we have 5 sectors to be mitigated. And then energy is number 2 after the forestry sector. So this is important. About 38% proportion will be from the energy sector. The subsector on energy comprise of renewable energy, energy efficiency, the clean power, fuel switching, and then post-mining reclamation. So that we have a quite high target to reduce the emission. For the energy sector, we do have several activities that we have to plan by 2030 to 2060. Here, this is we have to massive development of renewable energy to introduce like solar power plants, and then we have to use what we call the biomass, geothermal, hydro, ocean energy, nuclear, and then also hydrogen. And the new one is we like to have a strong policy on the battery energy storage system. And then for reducing fossil fuel or utilization of CCS and CCUS technology to make implementation of the what we call the power plant biomass or firing program, and then the power plant and then replacing the power plant from the coal and then from the gas. And there are no additional power plant except those that have been contracted or under construction. This is the quite a strong policy within the government. And then we like also to make a development of interconnection, transmission, and smart grid. So this is what we like to have within the energy sector to make what we call the neutral, the zero or neutral net zero emission by 2040 and then by 2050. And then what we like to do on to make a net zero emission in the future. One is to maintain national energy security, and then it is necessary to have a source of energy besides fossil fuel, for instance, to develop a biofuel. And then second, to support the national commitment in reducing carbon emission through effort to reduce motor vehicle exhaust emission and optimize the supply and distribution of fuel oil throughout Indonesia. Then the presidential regulation number 117 of 2021 has been issued, where a clean and environmentally friendly fuel roadmap will be established. So at this, we like to introduce. Now we have been doing now in terms of biodiesel, for instance, that this program of biodiesel or biofuel is one of the government's effort to develop renewable energy and reduce dependence of highly volatile petroleum. And then since early 2016, Indonesia has implemented a mandatory of use of 20% blended biodiesel, or we call that B20, and then B30 in 2030. Then the funding program is managed by what we call the Oil Palm Estate Fund Agency. This is incentive to disburse only to biofuel company to cover the price differentiation. And then the release of B30 in 2021 reached 9.3 million kiloliter, or saving of foreign exchange from the use of B30 amounted to about 4.6 billion US dollar. And then beyond B30, also the Indonesia government, through the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, has planned to conduct a road test of B40. This is blending of B30 by 10% or defarming, or B30 with 10% of HVO, and then starting this month. And then how about our refinery, the fossil fuel refinery? We developed what we call RDMP, that we call the revitalization of the existing refineries in several places. This is to produce a high quality fuel equivalent to Euro 5. And then we plan to have a new refinery, which is will produce petroleum and refinery that produce not only fuel, but also the organic basic chemistry industry that produce a chemical using raw materials from oil and gas. And then this is the last point that we are now try to develop the electric vehicle, or EV, battery industry development. The EV roadmap has been made, and then the construction and development of EV charging has been developed in several places. And then Ministry of Industry roadmap for 2- and 4-wheel electric vehicle target of 2 million units by 2025, or around 20% of car production. And then how about the fuel or energy subsidy? The subsidy program is the provision of support in the form of budget allocation to state companies, government agency, or third parties based on applicable laws and regulation to provide goods or services a strategic nature, or control the lives of many people, or distributed directly to beneficiaries in accordance with financial capabilities of the state. So that, and then to maintain people's purchasing power during the economic recovery, the government will still provide energy subsidy. And then by 2022, this year, the government continued to provision of fixed subsidy for diesel fuel, and then a price difference subsidy for kerosene. And then fossil fuel subsidy reform, I would like to differentiate two items. The first, fuel subsidy were given based on a price gap between fuel retail price and price determination, or government intervention. And then the price setting process takes into consideration factors such as macroeconomic development, purchasing power, and current social and political condition. And then second, the several policy have been implemented recently, such as the following. One is removal of subsidy for gasoline and applying fixed subsidy for diesel. Second, one price and one fuel price policy. This is important for the people that live in remote area or quite far from the cities, and then encouraging the use of biofuel as an alternative energy. And then the fourth is switching to gasoline use to a more qualified and environmentally friendly category. So that in terms of energy subsidy, we have a allocation by 2022 here in this table. So we have a fuel subsidy, which comprised around 11 trillion rupiah. And then the highest one is the subsidy for the LPG, what we call 3 kilogram LPG subsidy. It's about 66.3 trillion rupiah. And then the second in about electrical electricity subsidy, which is comprised around 56.5 trillion rupiah. So that totally, actually, we are still handling a subsidy on the fuel, but mostly in the limited fuel only. So thank you, Peter. That's I would like to explain this evening.
Thank you very much, Andy. Very interesting to hear the progress and the complexity that Indonesia has been facing in progressively reforming its subsidies over the years. And you saw in that last graph there that subsidies in Indonesia have been going down slowly in the energy sector, despite a very growing economy and a very growing population over the last few years. And there's one of the questions in the chat was, can you give examples of countries who've managed to reform subsidies with social protection and with taking account of the poor and vulnerable and so on? And Indonesia is a very good example of this. If you look back over the years there, it's been written up in a whole series of publications, and there's a lot to learn there about reinvesting really in regions, reinvesting in local people, reinvesting in communities and in infrastructure and in health, rather than putting the money into fossil fuel subsidies where a huge amount of the benefit leaks away to the rich and to those who don't need it. So please do keep your questions coming through as well. One to bear in mind for the speakers for later on is a comment somebody made about, aren't all fossil fuel subsidies inefficient given that we've got a climate crisis at the moment? So that's an interesting starting point about the definition, whether things have changed since 2009. Our final speaker today on the international process and forums is from New Zealand, and APEC was the host. New Zealand was the APEC host last year. They made serious efforts, as you'll hear, to push forward the issue of subsidy reform. And we've got a recorded intervention from Berget Schwenk. He's the Deputy Secretary of Trade and Economic at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He was the APEC 2021 Senior Officials Meeting Chair for New Zealand during their host year, has led a whole series of free trade negotiations, including with the EU, and served as permanent representative to the WTO, and is well known to a lot of us in the subsidy community for all his efforts in pushing this forward. So, but a recorded intervention from here, Jonas, if you could load that would be much appreciated.
My name is Vangelis Vitalis, and right up until the end of 2021, I am and was the APEC Senior Official Chair for New Zealand's host year. It was a real privilege of mine to do that, and what I wanted to talk to you today about is how we look to tackle climate change, and in particular, how the 21 APEC economies looked to deal with the question of fossil fuel subsidy reform, one of those perennial issues that we traditionally don't grapple with in APEC or indeed in any other forum in any meaningful way. In general, what we like to do in those international fora is we like to do some warm rhetoric that says we must do some reform. But in our host year, directed by our Prime Minister, we were very clearly instructed that warm words, the rhetoric, needed to be converted into action in our host year. But before I sketch out what it is that APEC achieved on fossil fuel subsidy reform, I wanted to step back a little bit and give you a bit of the context that we confronted in our host year. For a start, to state the obvious, COVID loomed large. On the day that we took over chairing of APEC in 2021, each day since we took over the hosting, 100,000 people in our region were infected by the virus. Each day. More than 1 million people in our region have died, and this human and health catastrophe has loomed very, very large over our entire hosting year, and indeed continues to trouble us all as we look to work our way forward. And of course, that human health catastrophe had an economic consequence as well, a very significant contraction of GDP across the Asia-Pacific region, across the 21 economies themselves, a widening of the gap between our populations and our people. And across APEC, there was a strong commitment in the immediate term to respond to the pandemic. But crucially too, what we looked to do was to position our region for the future as well. And it is that future that I really want to focus on, because APEC economies traditionally have not talked about climate change. It's easy to forget that before we started our host year, climate change had not featured in any of the leader statements until the Putrajaya Vision was issued as a consequence of Malaysia's chairing. We had the single 2 words, climate change, referenced there. In our host year, we wanted to change that. We wanted to change that because we're very, very aware across our region that the 21 of us account for 60% of the world's emissions. So we are a very significant contributor to a very serious problem. Now, I'm responsible for the trade and economic work of New Zealand. And in that context, one of the big things that I always talk about is the great uncertainty that has been created as a consequence, not just of the pandemic, but the geopolitical situation that we're in. We don't have that uncertainty when we're dealing with climate change. We know it's happening and we know we need to do something. In APEC, what we have done is a very significant step forward. It is not the solving of the problem, but it is the first serious step that any intergovernmental organisation has taken to address fossil fuel subsidy reform. I know that previous speakers will have spoken about the data, about the nearly $500 billion that gets spent of taxpayers' money on an activity that quite deliberately has a negative effect on climate change. In APEC, and it was a challenge to bring 21 economies, we're talking about economies as small as New Zealand and Brunei, right through to major economies like Indonesia, Russia, China, and of course the United States. As I said, 60% of global emissions are accounted for by the APEC 21 members. What it is that we tried to do in our year was to set a ceiling, in terms of what fossil fuel subsidies could be supported by governments. What we've agreed is a 4-step process. Leaders and ministers agreed at the end of New Zealand's host year that yes, they would tackle fossil fuel subsidies as a way of dealing with climate change. Specifically, they agreed that before the end of the first quarter of 2022, there would be a series of workshops and discussions around how exactly we would implement a template that was agreed in the New Zealand host year that records fossil fuel subsidies. Before the second quarter of the year, we would then start filling out that template. Each economy would be has committed to complete that template in terms of the subsidies that it has. And before the end of 2022, we would all agree not to increase subsidies that we have registered in that template. In other words, a standstill on fossil fuel subsidy reform will come into effect at the end of 2022 as a consequence of New Zealand's chairing and hosting of APEC in 2021. It is worth underlining how significant that commitment is. It is the first practical and real step that any group of economies has taken anywhere to address fossil fuel subsidy reform. Please don't forget that this was first launched in 2008, 2009 by the G20, who said they wanted to do this reform. APEC leaders and ministers have reaffirmed that commitment almost every year since 2009. We have done nothing. This year, for the first time, we are actually taking a concrete step. A standstill on fossil fuel subsidies is a real, practical commitment by the 21 of us who account for 60% of global emissions to address this fundamental challenge that we confront internationally. But APEC cannot do this by itself. G20, the COP26, we all need to pull together. We all need to take the first step. A standstill is just that first step, and then we actually need to do meaningful reform. And speaking of reform, one of the ways, and I'm just the trade guy, one of the ways in which we can deal with fossil fuel subsidies is to use trade rules to force change. And in this, New Zealand has led two important initiatives. The first in the World Trade Organization, where along with another significant group of WTO members, we have agreed to engage in a discussion in the World Trade Organization about how we might use trade rules to drive reform of fossil fuel subsidies. In other words, a contribution by trade to addressing climate change mitigation. The WTO is one thing, and that is an important area, and you will not hear a New Zealander describe the multilateral process as anything other than critically important. But we are not waiting. A group of us, 6 countries, New Zealand, Costa Rica, Fiji, Norway, Iceland and Switzerland, we have grouped ourselves together in an agreement that our leaders launched, Prime Minister Ardern in particular launched at the United Nations, called the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. At the heart of that trade negotiation is a commitment that the 6 of us will develop rules that will reform fossil fuel subsidies in our economies. But crucially, this is an example of an open plurilateral trade agreement. In other words, once we have completed this agreement, the 6 of us are committed to taking it out to other bigger economies. We are going to be saying to the G20, here is a meaningful way to address reform, to use trade rules. By the way in which we addressed agricultural subsidies was to use trade rules to drive reform. Let's not forget that was a major contribution of the Uruguay round. We are trying to do the same thing. We are not saying trade is the silver bullet that's going to solve climate change, but we are saying trade has to make a contribution. And what we've achieved at APEC, the 21 of us, through New Zealand's chairing, and also through the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability with the ACT's 6-member grouping, we do believe is going to take those critical first steps to drive real change, real reform, and real ways to address climate change. I wish you all the very best in this discussion, and I look forward to hearing very much about what the recommendations are that you're going to come out with. I'll be reading them closely. It is very, very important, the work that you do, and I do want to, in particular, pay a tribute to the work that the IISD, as always, is doing in this space. It is critically important to have the work that you do with the rigour with which you do it to drive real change, real reform on an issue that is, as I said at the start, certain and challenging and one of our real significant crises that we must deal with urgently. Thank you again for the invitation to speak. I do look forward to hearing your recommendations. Thank you.
Well, a very strong virtual thank you to Vangelis Vitalis there for all the efforts made by APEC last year, particularly culminating in this idea of a standstill. Still a little bit to be defined exactly what that will mean, but a way of looking at standstill is either no new subsidies are introduced with reference to the existing stet, and or the scale of subsidies does not increase from current value. So I think this starts to set up this movement we want to see from action to specific commitments, and some interesting lessons there for G7, G20 processes, and something to build on. And he mentioned as well there the First Movers Club under ACCTS, 6 nations getting together, and there are a whole range of initiatives now underway to help us progress towards real reform in this area. We move now to the second part of our agenda. Really happy, Ipek, thanks for your patience in waiting with us through the first part. Ipek Genks, who joins us from the ODI. She leads their work there on fossil fuel and energy subsidies, and has done for several years. She's got 10 years of experience in climate and energy policy, and also very usefully a focus on sustainable finance. So Ipek, you've heard from the major processes there and what could be some of the plans. What are you thinking from a more civil society perspective when we think about the 2025 end date, we think about the peer reviews, we think about having had a lot of high-level commitments for several years? How would you react to all of that?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you very much for inviting me to contribute from our perspective, but also representing many of the researchers and civil society organizations that work in this space. And thank you to all the presenters so far. It's really great to hear your insights leading these sort of key processes and countries that are very central to making progress on reforming fossil fuel subsidies. So I think based on everything that's happened in the past few years and the presentations today, we know we're in a different world. The Right Honourable Prince of Bourbon was alluding to this political momentum, and countries from around the world, leaders from around the world, have been making really bold commitments, which would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. So the transition is on its way. And I think, from ending international finance to all fossil fuels to making domestic commitments on certain things, this is happening, and there is no question about where we need to get to now. So the question is, how do we do it in an efficient and timely and socially just way without locking into further fossil fuel infrastructure in the coming years? And this is where, as Berget was saying, we have to stop sending contradictory signals. We can't promise the transition and where we need to get to, yet continue financing subsidies. So, we have this commitment from the G7, which is fantastic. We have the 2025 deadline, but that deadline is looming. So what does that mean in terms of what has to be done today, tomorrow, this year, next year, and so on, until we get to that absolute deadline date when we know there can be no subsidies to fossil fuels? So again, Berget was mentioning this, we cannot do this all at once. As you also said, Peter, we have to break it down. So what can we see this year in terms of countries really showing their efforts to put forward a roadmap of how they're going to break it down? It may be that they start with a particular type of fuel in terms of cutting subsidies, ending subsidies towards coal or oil or gas, depending on their country circumstances. It may be that they focus on different sectors. Or it might be that they work with other countries to start putting together a roadmap of meeting this 2025 deadline. But they have to start somewhere, because we cannot wait until the final date is right up close in 2025 and quickly wind down all subsidies. So the clock is ticking, and we need to start breaking down a pathway to that. Again, it was mentioned that Germany's presidency priorities include sustainable planet, including climate, and ambitions on decarbonizing industry. Again, what can this mean in terms of stopping fossil fuel subsidies to industry or different sectors? When it comes to the G20, I think, again, as I mentioned, we're in a different world. We cannot just rehash the same commitments back from 2009 that subsidies have to be reformed sometime in the medium term. I think we can all, even in climate terms, we can say that we're clearly in that medium term moment now. It's been more than 10 years since that commitment. So it really is time for the G20 to also set a deadline. The precedent by the G7 has been great. It's time for the G20 to also set a deadline and actually also start putting together plans to phase out different types of subsidies at different rates, and make sure that we are working towards a total phase out. Because the more we continue to provide subsidies and lock industry and consumption and production into fossil fuels, the more challenging it's going to be to reform them. Also, from the consumer's point of view, of course, we understand challenges. We have to absolutely support the vulnerable. One of the questions was alluding to this point. But we have to bite the bullet. We have to start doing it, because the longer we wait, the more challenging it's going to be. So I think what we would love to see this year is really some clear plans, a deadline by the G20, and some real steps in how we're going to action these commitments that have just been mere words so far. And just to make a comment on the inefficient subsidies point as well, again, this is something that governments have agreed to put in there to basically hide behind the definition of what inefficient subsidies are. Again, with where climate science has got us to, with where international movements and commitments have got us to in the past few years, we know that subsidies are not efficient, fossil fuel subsidies, because they are clearly against our climate targets. So I think it's time for governments to, if they do claim they have efficient subsidies, to explain what they are measure by measure, because I think it's very, very challenging to do in a world where climate commitments and climate science are so clear. So I'll pause my remarks there to allow the other panelists to also chip in, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thanks so much, IPEC, and we will definitely be coming back to you. And I think you're laying out a very interesting agenda here. We're in a different world. The medium term is here. Question really about whether there is any efficient subsidies, given that we're in a climate crisis, and a very sort of diplomatically put, I think, demand from civil society organisations, not to rehash the same commitments again under G7, G20. We've got to move forward. One area where we have moved forward recently is within the UNFCCC, and pleased to have with us today Jennifer Allen. She's a strategic advisor and team leader in IISD's Earth Negotiating Bulletin, which is a reporting service on UN environment and development negotiations. She's been following climate change, chemicals and waste since 2011, also a lecturer at Cardiff University, worked in forest, worked in air quality, and I think she's been very modest here. She's one of the best experts you can get on the UNFCCC process and the various elements within that, including about fossil fuel subsidies. So, Jennifer, I mean, the inclusion of fossil fuel subsidy reform in the Glasgow Climate Pact and the outcome text is being seen as a bit of a watershed moment by many of us in this working on this topic. You know a lot about the UNFCCC and the ways it works and the way things have moved forward. How do you see the importance of this, and how is that first mention in the Glasgow Climate Pact going to roll out as we move into COP27 in Egypt, COP28 in UAE? How might we leverage this commitment further?
Excellent questions that I don't know if I have answers to, but maybe a few ideas. And thanks for having me, Peter. I think one of the things also that I've heard from other panelists that we may want to reflect on is there's bits of this conversation happening in a lot of different forums that involve different countries, taking on various sort of language or commitments across these minilateral, medium lateral, very multilateral type of scales. And maybe a conversation to have at some point, or a question is it worth continuing the conversation in all of these other settings, or really focusing on one? And I'm not sure yet if the Paris Agreement has a role to play in that, as probably the most multilateral of all of the forums, except for the SDGs, where this conversation's happening. But there are sort of trade-offs to how many of these forums we can all keep track of, frankly, and try to inform and work within on any given issue. So that's a big question to start with, which then I'll conveniently ignore for a little bit. I think so. The Glasgow decision is interesting for a few reasons, I think. It's not the first time, actually, that subsidies have been mentioned in the context of the UNFCCC. So the Kyoto Protocol includes language about a progressive reduction, phasing out of market imperfections, tax, duty exemptions, and subsidies for all greenhouse gas emitting sectors. So while it doesn't put the words fossil fuels and subsidies together, one could just certainly read that that's where they're heading to some extent. But now we have the Paris Agreement taking over from the Kyoto Protocol. And for fossil fuel subsidies, especially a phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, I think it matters for a few reasons. It's the first time that the UNFCCC has really recognized that fossil fuel subsidies is a mitigation action. And so I think one of the big things that's come out of this is countries have now sort of put a stamp of legitimacy on fossil fuel subsidies as a legitimate mitigation action that countries can take. Now, potentially, and you know, this is a potential, that could help inform countries' NDCs, their pledges, nationally determined contributions. It could also help inform some of the types of projects that countries may put forward for support, technical or financial support, as a mitigation action that is now kind of has that stamp of legitimacy. Also, that the language is phasing out, I think to me implies more of a sense of direction than rationalizing fossil fuel subsidies like we see in other forums. So while some of the language in that paragraph wasn't as strong as many would like, particularly adding inefficient in there, there is a bit more of a sense of direction, I think. So overall it's a precedent, and precedents matter because it means that now there's something on the books. There's something that civil society, that other countries can point to say, this was a collective agreement by all parties to the UNFCCC and to the Paris Agreement. Also, a lot of international organizations are taking on climate change in the span of their work. So we've seen climate sort of mainstreamed across many areas of the UN system. And they do tend to look to the UNFCCC for a sense of direction. So potentially this could be then a conversation where they might take that signal from the UNFCCC into their own work. I think it also, this gives us a sense of where countries are really sitting. We kind of know a lot of the players about what they're thinking on fossil fuel subsidies, but this really gave us a sense to kind of bring some of that out. So the language about inefficient came from the US, China, India, South Africa. AOSIS put out a strong call to phase out all fossil fuel subsidies by 2023. So we're seeing that countries are widely divergent on this, but we're really getting a sense of where they're starting to plant their flags on that issue, which can help us sort of identify allies for moving this forward. Now, just to get a little bit lawyerly, which is dangerous because I'm not a lawyer. So I'm sure there's lawyers on this call that will correct me if I'm wrong though. This is in a cover decision, which is something used infrequently traditionally in the UNFCCC, but more and more in recent years. Usually it's used because there's a mandate that wants to they need a decision to make sense of the overarching narrative or the program of work from a COP. There wasn't such a mandate for this. And so it was the presidency that said, we need to keep space to have a conversation about mitigation. And we're going to use the covering decision to talk about that, but also a range of other issues like adaptation finance, for example. So this means that to some extent, this decision, while it is a COP decision and it has the same legal expectations that countries will do what they promised, it doesn't come with a fleshed out work program. So I don't remember seeing, and I don't think there is, any mode for reporting back. How are countries doing on this? There's no mode for following up or for further dialogues on how countries can achieve it. So we will see that this is likely to come up because it exists, it's set a precedent, it's something that everyone can point to, but it won't be in any formal agenda item where every year we're going to have this conversation in the UNFCCC. And because it's in this cover decision, and because for the most part, mitigation doesn't really come up anymore on UNFCCC agendas, this means it might be presidency dependent. So we have Egypt next, UAE next. The question is, to what extent are they going to be willing to put out political capital as the president to try to move this issue forward? There might be other entry points where maybe the Paris Agreement could help to sort of catalyze some action. So two that stand out, for me at least, is the negotiations for the new collective quantified finance goal. I was quite surprised how often fossil fuel subsidies were coming up in this conversation, because it was supposed to be for a quantified finance goal. The Paris Agreement sets out that there will be a new one in 2025, and maybe it's the lack of my imagination, but I thought basically we're looking for a number. And it became very clear in Glasgow that that's not the case. This will be quantified, we'll have a number, but there will also be a lot of qualitative aspects to it, because it's about the quality of climate finance, not just the quantity. So AOSIS mostly, but other countries were pitching in, talking about fossil fuel subsidies. So Peter, you mentioned swaps, redirecting fossil fuel subsidies or reducing how much we give to oil companies, for example, and putting that to climate finance. That's exactly the argument that some countries were making in the context of this new goal. The second potential entry point is the global stocktake. It's an 18-month technical phase that's this year and the first half of next year. And then there's a political phase that kind of builds on that and comes up with well, no one's really sure it's the first one. It's anticipated that it will come up with kind of a statement of here's where we're going. It's supposed to inform the next NDCs. that countries will be submitting in 2025 at the latest, if not sooner. So there is a sense that the stocktake matters a lot. This is a trial run for the stocktake, and there's a lot of inputs that have been identified. But there might be space to continue this conversation at this technical phase, but also the political phase of the stocktake. And that might help get the conversation about fossil fuel subsidies into countries' next NDCs and their next pledges. So that might be another option there, a role for the Paris Agreement. And then just a random example, because I raised at the beginning about all the different forums where this conversation is coming up. UNEA is having a conversation where they are widely expected to launch negotiations for a new plastics treaty. And some of the proposals on the table, I think from Rwanda and Switzerland, are talking about life cycle approaches and all the drivers that could potentially go into increasing not only the marine litter problem, but the production that leads to that problem, of which fossil fuel subsidies is another contributor. So if we don't have enough forums, potentially that is another one. So thanks, Peter.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Really good to hear that from an expert on what this decision really means, that it's a covered decision, that it could be presidency dependent. You mentioned the idea of one forum above all, and whether that makes sense. I think the sort of feeling at the moment or strategy in the recent past has been plant many flowers and see them all grow, but it's really interesting to see whether effort should be phased on one forum above others. And then thinking about other entry points into UNFCCC as well, and then the political signalling you mentioned are also very interesting. Is it possible in this area for all countries to move together at the same speed on the same subsidies, or do we need some sort of differentiation? Okay, our final speaker today, or intervention from our final speaker today, and then we'll still have more time for discussion. My colleague Lourdes Sanchez, Senior Policy Advisor in IISD's Energy Programme, but also the lead of our Indonesia programme, and being helping there to a major part of her work there to support Indonesia's government efforts to reform its subsidies in the energy field. Her focus includes both energy subsidies, but also evaluation and design of sustainable energy policies, and on communication strategies with many countries around the world on energy subsidy reforms and others. So Lourdes, the floor is yours. What we haven't heard much about today is really about the transparency issue and about SDG 12C1 and the reporting there. And just wondering, what can we learn from the data that's out there at the moment? Do we need more of it? Have we got what we need? And what are your thoughts on sort of transparency as a driver, as Berget mentioned earlier, being one of the priorities of the G7 German presidency this year? Your thoughts on that, very welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you also very much to the previous panelists for the excellent interventions. I'm going to share my screen. I hope that works. I guess I just have to make the full screen. So basically, I'm going to start sharing the numbers of the latest numbers we have of fossil fuel subsidies, as they have come recurrently in the conversation today. So I guess the screen is now fine, but well, what I'm going to be showing is the numbers that we have from the fossil fuel subsidy tracker that was mentioned before. It's a joint initiative between the IISD and the OECD, and basically it brings together the different international databases for fossil fuel subsidies according to the methodology defined by the SDG indicator on fossil fuel subsidies, so the 12.0.1. And basically the latest number we have is from 2020, and there we see that the value was in US dollars 375 billion, which actually went down the previous year, but we cannot forget that 2020 was a COVID year, and not only consumption went down, but also you might remember that oil prices went dramatically down in the year. So that definitely had a strong effect in the value of fossil fuel subsidies in that year. But actually most of the predictions or the forecast for 2021 is that they will go up as the economies started recovering. One of the things we can do with this fossil fuel subsidy tracker actually is look more in detail at what these subsidies are, and that's what I'm going to be showing now. So first I want to show the numbers in 2020 by fuel type, and we see actually that most of the subsidies went to petroleum products, so most of the quantified subsidies according to these databases. They went to petroleum products, and the second one is electricity. But actually, if we look also at how these subsidies or the amount of subsidies evolved versus the previous year, we actually see all of them decrease, as we saw in the global, but very interestingly, coal subsidies increased in 2020, despite the global number going down. I'm also going to show briefly the numbers by type of, by beneficiary, so basically producer versus consumer mostly. And we see that according to this methodology, according to this database, most of the subsidies are going to the consumption of fossil fuels. And then, also a big part to production. However, the reason why consumption subsidies are the highest is mostly because of the methodologies from two of the main databases that are included in these estimates, which are the IEA and the IMF, which basically look at consumer subsidies. So we can say that this number actually is, or the producer subsidies can be underestimated according to this number, but still we see that, the proportion according to this database is like that. Again, an interesting point, if we compare versus the previous year, is that while consumer subsidies went down and followed the global trend, producer subsidies actually increased, and mostly driven by the several COVID-19 measures given by certain countries that supported the production of fossil fuels. And just also mention briefly how this split actually works by type of fuel. And while consumer subsidies, most go to petroleum products, we saw in the previous slide that actually petroleum products are the main beneficiary of fossil fuel subsidies, then we see that electricity was actually the second main. If we look at producer subsidies, actually there we see a bit of a difference. So petroleum products still get the majority, so 56%, but then also we see gas as a major recipient of production subsidies. Like around 20% of these subsidies, they go to natural gas, followed closely by coal with 18% of the total subsidies. So this is it for the numbers. Basically, and then, what I want to talk, as Peter was mentioning, is also a little bit the subject of transparency, and also how we can use these numbers basically, or how we can use data to move on, or to promote, to support action basically. So the first point indeed is we see that these numbers, while they're still very helpful and already show a big level of detail, they are not fully complete, or they don't tell the full story, because again, for most of the countries that are included in this tracker, they're not detailing, the data are not based on detailed inventories. So basically the data we show are based on models designed by the IEA and the IMF that look mostly at consumption. So that means that what we are showing today is kind of biased towards consumption. There's still the production subsidies are very likely underestimated. And that's first thing that it's very important to know better, because as we see, there are different dynamics by type of subsidy and by type of fuel. So inventories can help identify these trends much better, especially if they're done according to the methodology of the SDG indicator. I think another important point that having more transparency can bring is that helps to achieve greater policy consistency. And what I mean with that is, for example, we've heard and we know that there are more and more countries, for example, committing to phase out coal. But then as we see, for example, coal subsidies are increasing production subsidies, and we see that they still are an important part of these numbers. So we need to make sure that public money is going to the right places and also forward looking. A similar thing happens with carbon taxes. And I think there were some questions also in the chat about that. So governments are imposing, carbon pricing is getting more and more accepted in a global, or is becoming part of the commitment of the global commitments. However, we see also, I didn't really show those numbers, but we see that a big part of the subsidies actually are in the form of tax exemptions, or taxes not received by governments. What means, again, why on one hand we're pricing something that in the other hand we are offering exemptions to. So those are some examples of why it is important to have more information or more transparency. Another point is also more transparency and more information helps us to determine, to define better target action. So we saw the intervention from New Zealand telling us about how APEC members have committed to not increase the fossil fuel subsidies that they report. So actually this should trigger policies and measures to contain these values, because we have seen the volatility of fossil fuel subsidies concerning the consumption and price. At the same time, and also very importantly, having more information can help countries define a roadmap for subsidy phase out by fuel and by measure, but also customized to the specific country context. So understand which are the subsidies that are being, I don't want to enter into efficiency or inefficiency, but basically the ones that are easier to reform, the ones that are actually, let's say, again, consistent with or inconsistent with other type of policies, and help define a specific roadmaps for those for phasing out those, as well as mitigation plans. Of course, that's also a very important part of any kind of reform policy. And I would say those are the main points concerning transparency. And yeah, happy to answer any additional question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lourdes, for getting into a little bit more detail there. Sort of what are the main types of subsidies there? We know that consumer ones are bigger than producer ones, but producer ones are almost certainly underestimated. And there's also, when you look at the detailed inventories that countries have done on fossil fuel subsidies, you often see a lot of entries with NQ written in them, which means not quantified. So people know there is a subsidy there, we know it's doing some damage. We don't know how big it is. The question there is, does it really matter? If we know it's moving our economies in the right direction, do we need more data? Thanks to all of you for putting your questions in the chat. I've been trying to formulate some sort of Uber questions based on all the ones that are put in place there. Maybe I could turn to you first, IPEC, and ask, from what you've heard there from Lourdes and from Jennifer Allen and from the previous speakers as well, you mentioned about a pathway needing to get to 2025. Where would you start? What's the sort of next step from your view? Is this looking at some particular subsidy types? Is it trying to build a first movers club? What's your reactions?
I think it really depends on the country. I think what we're seeing very clearly is that governments find it much easier to make commitments at a high level in terms of international public finance. But when it comes to reforming domestic subsidies, because they're voters and because specific industry and business are very much benefiting from the domestic subsidies, that's where the main challenges are. So it's about making it politically palatable to some extent to in the local context. And that's where I think some of the lower hanging fruit might be a good place to start. So where specific sectors and industries receive very high levels of subsidies, it might be a slightly longer process, but absolutely they should not shy away from starting that process. They might find it easier to start with other sectors where the industry is already shrinking, for example, as has been the case with coal in some countries, and there it's much easier for them to make these real commitments to phase out subsidies to those. And then again, when it comes to different stages of production of fossil fuels, for example, exploration, of course, we know that in a carbon constrained world, we are already, we know that the developed reserves are going to take us above our 2-degree target. And that's why civil society is calling for an absolute end to exploration and to keeping some of the discovered reserves in the ground to make sure that we have a chance of meeting 1.5-degree warming targets. So again, we can say that exploration is therefore a really important place to start, but then you could look at different stages of fossil fuel subsidy production. And then when it comes to consumers, again, one of the questions was about making sure that the reform process does not hurt vulnerable consumers in particular. But, again, looking at countries' own domestic circumstances, what are some of the measures that countries could start reforming, making sure that they support the communities that will be affected, the consumers that will be affected. Again, it's not going to be easy, but making sure that we're learning from the experiences of countries such as Indonesia, India, where there have been positive reform stories. what are the ways in which these have been successful, looking at specific measures, looking at supporting specific consumers. I think there's definitely some lower hanging fruit for countries to start begin with.
Thank you very much, IPEC. Maybe Berget, thanks very much for staying with us, and I hope the conversation and the interventions have been useful. Sort of reflections from your side on sort of how do we move from the higher level down to the next level.
Thank you very much, Peter. There have been quite a number of questions in the chat that were addressed to me. So as you said, some Uber questions, or I'll try to summarize my answers to some of these. There have been actually few questions, even I think, on the question of why do we still invest in gas infrastructure. I think I've seen that a number of times. And actually, one of the questions asked me directly whether I've read the latest IISD report on that. Frankly, of course we've read this. It's an excellent study, and frankly, we've actually been working together with the IISD on this study. So the thing is that I actually agree that it's a lot more worthwhile to invest in renewable energies, and this is actually our priority. Our minister, my minister, in early January already published a big stock taking that we've done very quickly on where we stand with respect to our climate targets, and that includes on where do we stand with respect to renewable energies. And we actually find we have to accelerate that sector very much. We have to be a lot quicker in installing wind and solar energy, but this will take time. So if you want to invest, for instance, in a wind energy installation now, it will only be up and running in a few years. Procedures take time. So knowing this, we know that in the next few years, we will still need gas. We take precautions that we don't get into lock-ins. So whatever we invest in now in terms of gas infrastructure will be H2 ready. So we're trying to make sure that we get into a hydrogen economy on this, which we're going to need green hydrogen. So this is one of the answers to avoid a lock-in. And of course, you also have to consider we're a very large economy, and we're actually phasing out coal and nuclear energy at the same time, which is also, I have to say, a bit of a task. And we consider nuclear energy as unsustainable. So this is our decision. But as I said, this makes things a bit more complicated. So to sum up, this will only be a bridge, gas. Of course, as we manage to increase our share of renewable energies, the need for gas will go down. So I hope we will get there very, very soon. But at the moment, as I said, this is a bridging transition technology. So that is my answer to that complex of questions that has been in the chat. Now I'll have to have a look. Wait a minute. What else have we had? Are you going to help me, Peter? What else do I have?
Any reflections? Really on
okay. There's a question about taxation as well. We look into all areas of, let's say, sustainable financing. The German government has come up with a sustainable finance strategy. And so we have to use a number of instruments, and taxation obviously is something that we look into as well. And as I said, subsidies, phase out subsidies, taxation issues, taxation reform, and of course regulatory means. So it's a whole range of issues. There has been a question of, I think, socially equitable approaches. That is one of the biggest issues. I think there we actually have an issue. Well, there we actually have to consider what is an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy. I think it has been mentioned by someone that this might only be a greenwashing to speak about inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I wouldn't agree there. We have a number of subsidies that are just handed out to everyone, to all companies, to all households, all income strata at the same level. And this is not socially equitable. So we're looking into making subsidies more efficient in terms of they should only benefit really the weak in income or the people that are really in need of subsidies. So while this might not mean phasing out a subsidy completely, it would actually make sure that it's very targeted and that it serves a purpose that is also within, let's say, the Sustainable Development Goals. So that is one of the answers to this one. Now, and actually, I have been speaking quite a lot, so maybe you want to also ask others, but if you have a question that I haven't answered so far, please.
No, I think that's great. Thanks for going very carefully through all the questions there. Andy, did you want to comment at all as well with any sort of reflections from the Indonesia perspective and the G20?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I try to answer several chat, and then actually we understand that the fossil fuel subsidy will distract the economy, and some people try to ask how to replace the subsidy to other activities or sectors, and then say, for instance, to be used to develop more clean energy. But as I saw in the data that the subsidy mostly for the what they call the 3 kilo LPG subsidy, and then second for the electricity. So we try to have to give to direct subsidy, the targeted subsidy, mostly to the poor people or the small medium industry, for instance, but it takes some time. But I think our target to make the subsidy reform might help our economy in the future. And then I read that if there is any chance to join the agreement on climate change threat and sustainability within the G20, I don't see any agenda this year. But we'd like to take a look if we can have some discussion how to make such meeting or discussion, whether this is going to be a part of the energy transition as the theme of the G20. Is there anything left, Peter, that maybe I can answer?
No, I think that's great, Andy, and really, I'm surprised it came so late, but this idea of targeting as well is just so important. I mean, there's some questions here in the chat about peer reviews that Germany and Indonesia have both undertaken amongst other countries, and in every single peer review that we've seen, when countries have looked at the subsidies they've got, they've always seen there are opportunities to target them better, even if they can't move to an immediate reform. So there's options there. Some of these subsidies have been in place a long time and can be better targeted and better focused so that the benefits are going to those who need them, not to the general population, which is what happens so much, or the general economy, which happens so much with subsidies. We need to bring things to a close. I think we could talk for hours and hours on this issue. Firstly, thanks to all the speakers today. We started with our intervention from the Netherlands, from Jaime de Bourbon. We then heard from Berget and from Andy and from Vangelis Vitalis from APEC. Jennifer Lourdes, thank you very much for your ideas and for your detail and for your analysis and sort of helping us to move to the next track. People always say I'm not going to try and summarize what happened in this workshop, but I am. I think you should. We are looking at this next level of commitments, going from action to a next level. What do we know? We know this is part of a bigger debate. It's come across very strongly today. We're talking about international public finance, energy transitions, energy poverty, energy access. You know, the list goes on, and climate change more generally. We know the direction of travel has to be that fossil fuel subsidies need to be reformed quickly, all of them. Yeah, we can't. I don't think we don't have the luxury anymore of saying let's look at subsidies as a whole class and say, you know, because we can point to some cases where there are potentially impacts on the poor and vulnerable, or on a sensitive industry or a sensitive sector, it's hard to make progress. We need to break the problem down and say there is a clear direction of travel, and we need to have the default position that subsidies should be reformed as soon as possible. Some can go now. Interesting from Lourdes's presentation that coal subsidies have gone up last year. That's clearly not what we want to see. I think IPEC made the same point that coal can go. In upstream exploration, why would we subsidize that going forward when we already have more oil and gas reserves identified than we need if we're going to meet even 2.0 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. So an end year is very important, 2025. It's very close. I think we pass on our views to G7, G20, you know, make sure that end date is in there and that there's plans to work towards that. And there's talks about pathways and about roadmaps. You know, what exactly are they going to have in them? Are they going to be a set of subsidies where they're effectively, in trade language, prohibited, and we say no more subsidies to these areas? Possibly a default condition that other subsidies will go, but will take a little bit longer, but we need individual timescales for those. And then some others where exceptions will really have to be strongly argued for. And I think one of the realities we see, Berget, you brought it up right at the beginning, is, you know, no country could get rid of all subsidies now. It's just not possible. And then if we apply that to a set of countries and you say, you should all get rid of this particular subsidy now, it's going to be even harder. So let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. I think in this case, what we need to see is, you know, each country taking, you know, showing what it's got in terms of transparency using SDG 12C1 or, you know, an equivalent UN type format. What have you got? Which of these can you move on straight away? Which of these are you struggling with a little bit more? But a direction of travel towards reform for all of them. Clear need for countries and the community to learn from each other. Very good to hear again from G7 that you're going to be looking to share experiences and have some of these joined up discussions between, you know, what are often quite isolated officials looking to deal with these problems in different countries. So, you know, it's the 1st of February, it's the beginning of an incredibly important year for subsidy reform. It's great to have the G7 and G20 involved in this issue. We heard that APEC's on the right track too, UNFCCC, SDGs, WTO, so loads of high-level support, and we look forward to helping to facilitate the conversations that we need to bring this reform together. So thanks again to all the speakers, thanks to all the audience, a lot of you and a lot of you still on. And we look forward to helping to push forward this issue with you all this year. So goodbye for now, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all.